Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Just as a reminder, this is Science by the Slice. This is the series that's put out by the RDP chapter of Sigma Chi in collaboration with American Scientists, which is the company I run. Hi. And the North Carolina, sorry, Science Communicators of North Carolina. And we also get funding for the pizza from the NC Biotechnology Center. So all of us work together to put this on and feed you guys. So thanks to them. Just as a reminder, we work on an academic calendar. This is our last event until September. If there are other events that come up during the summer that might interest you all, you might get emails about them. But this is the last Science by the Slice until September. So hopefully we'll be back then. Fingers crossed on grant renewals and all that, considering the times we are in. But yeah, so just a couple of reminders before we get started. Sigma Chi's annual conference this year has gone virtual, which makes it easier to get to. So please check out that program. It'll be at the end of October, beginning of November. And hopefully you guys can join in on that. And also, if you've missed any of our past talks, we do post videos on the American Scientist website, so you can go there to. So today, we are really very lucky to have a great speaker. We've got Dr. Ryan Emanuel, who's a hydrologist and community engaged scholar from North Carolina. He studies hydrology, environmental science, and indigenous rights at Duke University, where he is an associate professor of hydrology and program chair for community engagement and environmental justice in the Nicholas School of Environment. Dr. Emanuel, and take it away. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'll bring my drink up with me if that's okay. So thanks to Sigma Chi and Science Communicators and other folks for inviting me out. I was involved with Sigma Chi many years ago when I was on faculty at Appalachian State. I had great experience with the organization then, and it introduced me to a number of inspiring science communicators that I have aspired to emulate to some extent in my work. So today, I want to share a little bit with you about the backstory behind my recent book, On the Swamp. Although it would be helpful rather than giving sort of a traditional research presentation. I especially want to talk about how I came to write the book and how it reflects more or less a decade-long expansion of my work as an academic scientist into other areas of theory and practice. Especially environmental policy, humanities, research ethics, and indigenous rights. I think it's especially important for those of us who study and work in the natural sciences to think about how our work relates to these other areas of knowledge. I will say that many of the areas that we work on, especially in the environmental sciences, are deeply affected by colonialism, whether or not we grapple with it explicitly in our work. I think that the work that we do can benefit from a clear understanding of how the colonial project of extracting wealth and displacing indigenous peoples, both as a historical process and as an ongoing process, can influence how we think about our work and move through the world, including how we decide on which topics to study in our research, which questions or hypotheses we choose to address. I've written bits and pieces elsewhere about this philosophical bent in the years since I finished writing the book. So if you're interested, I refer you to a 2022 article in Southern Cultures that I wrote with Karen Berg, or a book chapter that I wrote in 2023 for Michelle Montgomery's edited volume called Voices of Indigenuity, or last fall's November issue of Bioscience, where I have a commentary about indigenous knowledges and its relationship to environmental sciences. So with that said, I am a Lumbee person. I'm also going to find my cursor and get rid of this message at the top of the screen. There. This is my homeland. It is a beautiful place on the Lumbee River, but it's marked by colonialism. It's been transformed by centuries of exploitation for timber and other resources, pollution, most of it unseen in the air and the water, unsustainable development happening upstream in this watershed, and also climate change, which has a intensifying pressure on all of these other factors. The Lumbee River is a blackwater stream that cuts through our ancestral and present day homelands in what's now the coastal plain of North Carolina, so southeastern part of the state. My book features several stories about how Lumbee people and our indigenous neighbors experience and deal with all of these different changes to our homelands. And as I said before, my goal for this talk is to tell you why I wrote the book and also to share some of the intersections of science and humanity that come along with the changes that I talk about. But before we go there, I want to point out that in addition to the work that we do, it also takes reflection on this colonial project to put all of these phenomena, climate change, pollution, unsustainable development, into a broader context. In fact, I started the book with a call for readers to consider this broader context by outlining the long history of colonial exploitation that has happened right here on the coastal plain. So those of you who are familiar with institutional land acknowledgements, I call on folks to think about that chapter of the book as a reimagined land acknowledgement for my homelands. It critiques the performative nature, so the showy nature of land acknowledgements that have cropped up through the US in the past decade or so. But it also calls on us to envision a land acknowledgement as a story that can take a while to tell. So here, I'll start by reading a brief excerpt from that chapter for you all. More than 50 years ago, Lakota scholar Vine Deloria Jr. lamented the proliferation of what he called, quote, easy knowledge about Indians. In his groundbreaking book, Custer Died for Your Sins, Deloria explained that settlers have always been quick to explain who Native Americans are, where we came from, and even unnervingly, what it's like to be us. Deloria's words ring true today when it comes to the accessibility of resources for crafting land acknowledgements. Maps and more are at our fingertips. Unfortunately, this easy knowledge does little to promote reciprocity, accountability, or redress for the expropriation of indigenous territory. Instead, it reinforces the idea that land acknowledgements are simply fill-in-the-blank exercises in which the only tricky part is correctly pronouncing the name of a tribe that one has discovered through a web-based tool. I hope that readers will see in a new light some of the perfunctory phrases embedded in popular land acknowledgements. One that I hear regularly is, "These are the ancestral lands of." That phrase carries both truth and trauma that can slip past uneducated ears. Indigenous homelands on the coastal plain are places of deep connection and remembrance, but they're also places where traumatic experiences befell our ancestors. That trauma still flows through our communities today. The pain of racial oppression and cultural loss combines with the traumatic transformation of our homelands, and it haunts us from generation to generation. I know the look and feel of these traumatic experiences. I belong to a people who are still afflicted by these legacies of oppression. We cannot talk about our connections to place unless we grapple with the long-term impacts of settler colonialism on the coastal plain, the 25,000 square mile swath of present-day North Carolina that stretches from the base of the Piedmont to the barrier islands that jut into the Atlantic Ocean. The connections that Lumbee people and our indigenous neighbors hold to our ancestral landscapes and waterways on the coastal plain are strong, but they're colored by the trauma of generations. My intent is not to give an oversized platform to violence and oppression, but rather to set the stage for other stories that explain present-day environmental issues faced by Lumbee people and our neighbors. It's not possible to understand these issues without a basic grasp of what Lumbees and our indigenous neighbors have experienced in the long centuries since settlers first arrived. This chapter is not the easy knowledge that Deloria criticized, but it's also not a thorough telling of our stories. Instead, consider it a partial antidote to the trend of cheap and easy land acknowledgements that reduce Indigenous peoples' long and complex relationships to a brief recitation. If it helps, consider this chapter a reimagined land acknowledgement for Eastern North Carolina, or maybe simply take a seat and listen. That's an example from the beginning of the book of how I try to set the stage for the stories and case studies that come later on. And I'll say that I wrote the book in part as a model for students and professionals and even the general public how to use frameworks and concepts like environmental justice and Indigenous rights to understand and address the connections between present day environmental issues that many of us, including myself, study, and settler colonialism that props up the disparities that are laid bare by these pressing environmental issues. I also wrote the book for my people. I wanted to share some of the stories of our survival and resilience and adaptation in the midst of all of these changes to our homelands. To be clear, I'm writing about my people, the Lumbee, but also about our Indigenous neighbors in what's now North Carolina. These include Coharie, Waccamaw Siouan, Halawassaponi, and others. My ultimate goal was to do right by both of these audiences. I really think that the future is riding on the extent to which the public understands environmental justice and Indigenous rights clearly and not just as buzzwords. And the practice of telling our stories is important for ensuring that Indigenous peoples are part of the decisions about the future of our lives that really affect all of us. And so having said that, the backstory is that I didn't set out to write a book at all. I'm trained as a hydrologist, a water scientist. I went into that field because I was drawn to the outdoors. I love water, forests, mountains, but I also like math and physics and computer modeling. And it turns out that hydrology is a field that lets you combine all of those things. All of my academic training focused on Western scientific frameworks for understanding rivers and their surrounding watersheds as complex integrated systems. And for the first several years of my career, I focused almost exclusively on environmental fieldwork, modeling, and data analysis in places like the Northern Rocky Mountains and the Southern Appalachians and coastal North Carolina. On the left is one of my graduate students from NC State back in his home country of Honduras, where he's installing a water monitoring station to understand the impacts of agroforestry on water quality. And on the right-hand side, that's me as a young professor at Appalachian State, which is a predominantly undergraduate institution, where we built an atmospheric monitoring station to study air quality and weather around Boone. So I was trained to measure and monitor and quantify the environment using sensors and technological tools. Early in my career, I actually moved from Appalachian State to NC State, where I continued building a research and teaching program that focused on eco-hydrology, interactions between plants, soils, and water, in all kinds of environments from mountains to sea. And that work has continued in the 3 or so years I've been at Duke. Importantly, when I moved off the mountain down to the Triangle, it allowed me to be closer to home. Lumbee homelands are less than 2 hours from right here in the Triangle. I'm privileged to live that close. From an early age, my Lumbee family taught me that the purpose of education was to serve your people. And maybe some of you come from communities that have that same value. And at least for me, when it comes to serving your people, proximity matters. One problem with serving your people, though, is that you don't always get a lot of career-specific advice. In my case, Lumbee communities produce a lot of physicians and attorneys and teachers, but not many environmental scientists. In fact, I didn't meet any Lumbee environmental scientists or any Native American scientists until I was a professor myself. So think about this, the first time I was in a classroom with a Native American professor was on my first day of teaching at Appalachian State. I was a professor. So that took a lot of creativity and faith to figure out how that worked. But I spent a lot of time wandering around academically to find out what it means to bring my authentic self to my work. And so one of my professional goals is to model that kind of authenticity for my students and hope that they won't have to wander around so much out of necessity like I did. Of course, some amount of wandering can be helpful, but my larger point here is that representation matters. I had a lot of mentors and role models, but in the absence of a Lumbee-specific roadmap, it took a long time to figure out what it meant to serve my people as a scientist and a professor. So fresh, young academic professor at App State, I decided I was going to become an ambassador for STEM education and for higher education in general. I started going to college recruiting events. I hosted visiting groups of high school students on campus, and I led science field days for Lumbee students. It was great, but it was kind of disconnected from my day-to-day work as a scholar. And all of that changed about a decade ago when the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs invited me to advise their newly formed Environmental Justice Committee, which was made up of Indigenous leaders and decision makers from all over North Carolina. And everybody on that committee had a vested interest in protecting the communities and landscapes that they cared about and that their ancestors had come from since time immemorial. It was difficult for me to join that committee because I had no background in environmental justice or even environmental policy, but I knew that the time was right and that this work needed to be done. And I want to pause for a moment to make sure that we're all oriented to the indigenous peoples of North Carolina. This is a map from my book that shows the wetlands of our region in dark gray, along with the names of several of the tribal nations that presently live in North Carolina. Many of these communities comprise the survivors of historic indigenous peoples whose societies were radically disrupted by the encroachment of settlers and colonial practices in the early 1700s. We are all diverse and complex peoples culturally and politically. And one recurring theme throughout the book is how our political statuses can either help or hinder our efforts to protect and safeguard our homelands. And I'll give you an example. So Lumbee people in particular have a singularly unique political status in the United States. Our tribe is governed by a 1956 federal law that acknowledges us as an American Indian tribe, but prohibits a formal government-to-government relationship between the tribe and the federal government. I also want to point out that there are other indigenous peoples who have ties to this geography, including Tuscarora people, whose ancestral homelands include a large swath of the coastal plain. And I will also say that indigenous peoples of the coastal plain have strong ties to very specific wetlands, rivers, and coastal waters that are so abundant in this region, especially as you move east of the fall line. And the fall line is really where the prevalence of wetlands picks up. They're roughly along the location of Interstate 95. And I just love showing people from outside our region images of our beautiful wetlands. If any of you have been to Phelps Lake, this is the bald cypress forest that rings the edge of that lake. And here are some more amazing ancient bald cypress trees along the Black River. This is an old growth swamp. It's one of the only places in the Southeast spared from logging at the turn of the 20th century. Has anybody ever visited these ancient trees? So they're really hard to get to, and that's why they were saved from logging. As a result, like these trees in this photograph, in these two photographs, are more than 2,500 years old. I think that makes them the oldest trees in Eastern North America. Here are those beautiful bald cypress trees along the Lumbee River. main channel in the background. And you can see those distinctive cypress knees jutting up through the floodplain soils. The Lumbee River's floodplain is really spectacular. I write about it at length in the book. The river meanders back and forth through this wide belt of green bald cypress forests. And here you can really see that dark tea-colored water. And that color, of course, comes from dissolved organic matter that's picked up from organic soils in the floodplain, also in the headwaters of this watershed. This is another view, aerial view of the Lumbee River, this time in the winter. Bald cypress is cool because it is a deciduous conifer. So it has cones and needles, but the needles turn red and fall off every fall. And so what you're seeing in this image are the naked gray trunks of those bald cypress trees. In addition to organic soils, the headwaters are also full of white quartz sand. The headwaters themselves are ancient sand dunes. And the point bar that you see in the upper part of this photograph is actually bright white sand, but you're seeing it beneath that dark stained water. And just for context, this stretch of the Lumbee River is about 60 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. So that's our geographic situation as Indigenous peoples of the coastal plain. And this was the context that I had when I started working among leaders from my tribe and other tribes in North Carolina on this environmental justice committee about a decade ago. And as I started working in different communities, I started to see commonalities in our cultural attachments to these kinds of places and how the waters of our homelands connect us culturally to our ancestors and our history. I saw these things while I was paddling with members of the Coharie tribe, for example, or visiting culturally important springs for the Hawasaponi people, and spending time on my own ancestral river, the Lumbee. And as I traveled across North Carolina, I listened carefully to understand the ways that Indigenous people think about their relationships to water here in North Carolina. This is Philip Bell from the Coharie tribe. He features prominently in a case study in the book that looks at how the Coharie tribe has practiced their own culturally based restoration of the Great Coharie River over the past several years. Through all of these interactions, I also caught glimpses of threats to our waters, threats from fossil fuel infrastructure, including the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a shale gas project that would have fed several brand new gas-fired power plants in North Carolina and Virginia. From 2017 to 2020, I worked alongside those commissioners on the Environmental Justice Committee to understand the pipeline's impacts on our communities. During this time, 2017, I first started to write about environmental justice, which is at its core all about the equitable treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision-making. For Indigenous peoples, meaningful involvement means appropriate engagement during the decision-making process and appropriate acknowledgement of the unique cultural harms that this type of project can cause. And so in 2017, I published a brief commentary in Science explaining how everybody benefits from meaningful tribal engagement and how everybody suffers when it doesn't happen. I coupled that commentary with a pretty simple analysis showing how federal regulators had completely overlooked large Indigenous populations when they were carrying out what was at the time a mandatory environmental justice analysis, which for US regulatory agencies was typically just a demographic study to determine whether low wealth or racially marginalized groups face disproportionate harm from a particular project or policy. On this map, you can see several North Carolina tribes whose homelands would have been disrupted by the pipeline. And the inset map shows the pipeline's terminus, which was situated right in the heart of a historic Lumbee community called Prospect. And if you're not familiar with this work, overall, some 30,000 indigenous people lived along that skinny pipeline route in North Carolina. They made up 13% of all of the people living along the pipeline route. And if that number sounds small, consider that at the time, North Carolina had a total indigenous population of only 120,000 people, and we made up about 1% of North Carolina's population. So that's about as clear an example of a demographic disproportionality that I can give you. In fact, it's now literally a textbook example. This case study shows up in at least 2 different textbooks that are used to teach environmental justice in environmental schools and law schools across the US. At the end of the science commentary, I pointed out that pipeline proponents incur setbacks and delays when they don't take environmental justice and tribal engagement seriously. And almost exactly 3 years after I published this piece, the proponents canceled the entire project after legal challenges had delayed construction by years and raised the estimated cost from $4.5 billion to nearly $8 billion. I don't take credit for that, but I will say that I predicted it 3 years in advance. I learned so many lessons, though, throughout my years of research and advocacy on this particular project, and it forms the most detailed case study in my book. So this case study is at the very heart of the book. Around that same time, while I was putting this case study in the context of the book, I was also doing other research on the disproportionate impacts of natural gas pipelines on marginalized and vulnerable populations in the US. This is a figure from a 2021 study that I led showing that across the country, US pipelines are packed more densely in areas where social vulnerability is higher. Social vulnerability is a composite index. It represents a community's ability to recover from adverse events. It could be health, economic, natural disasters, and so forth. Yellow areas are more vulnerable on this map. Blue areas are less vulnerable. So those yellow areas have less ability to recover from adverse events. And those areas tend to have more gas pipelines. You can see the correlation coefficients at right, taken from this scatter plot. It shows that the correlation is most pronounced at extreme pipeline densities. In other words, if you live in a low vulnerability class or set of counties, and I asked you what is a high pipeline density, you might say 20 kilometers of pipeline per 100 square kilometers of area. But if you were in a high social vulnerability class, and I said, what's a high pipeline density? You would say, 50 to 60 kilometers of pipeline per 100 square kilometers of land area. And so over the years, I also caught glimpses of threats to our homelands from industrial livestock pollution. This is a massive bank of 48 industrial poultry sheds that were under construction back in 2019. When I say massive, each one of these buildings is 600 feet long and 60 feet wide. So unlike swine operations, which we hear a lot about in the news, the poultry facilities require no water quality permits in North Carolina. So there's very little public information about them, but they're major sources of nutrient and bacteria pollution to nearby groundwaters and surface waters. These livestock facilities, of course, have been a major focus of research here in North Carolina for decades. Several years ago, I worked with a colleague at NC State to see how those facilities are represented in land cover data sets, given that those buildings individually are so big that each one could take up multiple grid cells in the US National Land Cover data set. We found that 14% of all of the swine facilities were classified as wetlands in this data set. This is important for people who use land cover data for modeling to consider, because those facilities essentially have the opposite ecological function as wetlands, right? We think about wetlands as mediating pollution or ameliorating pollution by absorbing nutrients and pathogens. But these facilities exacerbate it instead of mediate it. I also witnessed firsthand threats from climate change when Hurricanes Matthew and Florence inundated eastern North Carolina several years ago. This is one of my graduate students who was with me at NC State, is still with me at Duke, Jocelyn. We're collecting water samples here from the Great Coharie River right after Hurricane Florence back in 2018. Those samples were part of a larger rapid response project that eventually identified poultry gut bacteria, along with many other pathogens associated with both human and animal waste that were widespread across these floodwaters after Hurricane Florence. We were in the field that day with two elders from the Coharie tribe, Greg Jacobs, who's taking the photo, and Philip Bell, who you saw in the photo with the kayak earlier. And I'll just say it was a rough time in terms of the stench of animal waste mixed with floodwaters that permeated the whole area. And I write about that in the book. I have a chapter dedicated to industrial livestock pollution and another chapter that's dedicated to flooding that's intensified by climate change. I will say that this day in particular made real for me the connection between all of the threats that I've talked about so far, and that I write about in the chapters of the book. Fossil fuel consumption drives climate change that brings floods that spread animal waste across the landscape. But that day made me value the peaceful times about our homelands even more than I had before. This is a section of the Lumbee River that's a popular refuge during the summer. People picnic here, they swim and fish just as they have for centuries. And it was really this love of the river as a place. So the river as a geography that drove me to pull all of these stories together into a book. But I also had to give context for readers that didn't really understand what I meant by the long and traumatic history of colonialism in Eastern North Carolina. And I tell stories like the one that is represented in this particular monument, which was erected on the site of one of the most violent conflicts in the colonial South. And it's located just outside of Greenville, North Carolina, where militia led by settlers from South Carolina laid siege to a massive indigenous fortification along Contentnia Creek, which is one of the major tributaries to the Neuse River. On this site, 900 Tuscarora people and their allies were killed or captured and sold into slavery in the Caribbean in 1713. And so I wanted people to understand how that event and others like it fractured indigenous societies and set the stage for centuries of discrimination and marginalization that in some ways has lasted up until the present. Along the way, I explained to readers the idea of ecological refugia. Some of you may be familiar with how species survive in favorable microclimates during periods of climate change. And I linked this idea to the ways that wetlands served as refugia for indigenous peoples of the coastal plain during this period of colonization. So in the book, I summarize an analysis that I did a few years ago of nearly 100 historic maps of North Carolina. It shows that settlers could not accurately map Lumbee homelands until around the year 1800. Which to me at least is shocking given that settlers have permanently occupied this region from the 1600s onwards. This is less than 100 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. So think about this for a moment. Settlers are making sweeping claims about where indigenous peoples did or did not live in the Carolina colonies as early as the mid-1700s. And at that time, they had little or no knowledge about the actual place where Lumbee ancestors were living at the time. This analysis is important because it changes how we think about colonial documents as authoritative records of indigenous people's existence. And I will say that I created a topological scoring system for all of these maps because I did not want to disadvantage map makers and surveyors that lacked access to modern surveying tools, not just GPS, but standardized rods and chains and things like that. So topological considers the network structure of a river basin rather than the latitude and longitude. And it let me score all 100 of these maps on an equal playing field, more or less. I also write about indigenous resistance to colonialism because it's not all about defeat and retreat. Talk about the decade-long guerrilla war led by Lumbee hero Henry Berry Lowry. Lowry was one of many Lumbee men who fled into the swamps to avoid conscription and to hard labor during the Civil War. Lumbees were actually drafted to build Confederate fortifications in coastal North Carolina during that war. And historian Melinda Maynor Lowry's helped to tell that story in recent years. So Henry Berry Lowry led a band of freedom fighters who launched raids against local white supremacists, militias, and even federal troops during Reconstruction. He was demonized by local whites, but he was considered a champion by Indigenous and Black people in the area. He disappeared in 1872 at the height of this guerrilla war, and his burial place, his final resting place, is unknown. So for many Lumbee people, the entire river is a memorial to this hero. I also wanted people to understand what contemporary cultural and historical preservation looks like for Lumbee people. I tell the story about the burning of and restoration of Old Main, which is a historic building on the campus of UNC Pembroke. Of course, that institution was founded by Lumbee ancestors during the 19th century as a teacher training school. During that time, white supremacists in Eastern North Carolina were enforcing a triracial apartheid, creating separate facilities for whites, African Americans, and Indigenous people. The Training Institute allowed us to staff our schools with Indigenous teachers and administrators who came from our own communities. And as a result, these schools were very different from the Indigenous boarding schools that we've heard about in the news and cause so much harm to Indigenous peoples elsewhere. And I'll be clear, these schools still focused on Western European education, but at the same time, they helped to maintain Indigenous communities and cultures throughout Eastern North Carolina. And this was not very long ago. Both of my parents attended segregated Indian schools all the way from first grade to high school. And I'm only part of the first generation of Lumbees to attend integrated schools. This book also explores how cultural preservation and collective ownership look for Lumbee people, because they came together to save this building from demolition in the early 1970s, to petition for its renovation after it burned due to arson around that time, and how they were able to turn it into a home of the first American Indian Studies academic department in the South. And so that story focuses on the built environment, but it highlights important themes about how Lumbee people view collective ownership and belonging. And one of my favorite quotes of all times comes from this chapter. Ruth Revels, a Lumbee educator, wrote this really impassioned letter to a local newspaper editor, which included this line: "There's more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things we all own were not bought and paid for with money." And it was an amazing experience for me last summer when I had the honor to do a book reading in front of the now restored Old Main, which today houses that Department of American Indian Studies, as well as the Museum of the Southeast American Indian. And by golly, I'm wearing the exact same clothes in that picture I'm wearing. Thankfully, I tucked in my shirt today. Finally, I use the book to encourage all of us to think about how we can reconnect with culturally important waters. Because when any of us, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, take time to form attachments to particular places, I think it helps us to see them more like relatives to care for and respect rather than resources to exploit. And I think that that shift in perspective is an essential part of unwinding the tendrils of colonialism that affect the way we move through the world and conduct our work as scientists and students and professionals, or at least acknowledging that that other perspective exists can be important for the work that we do. It's a tall order, but I really did write this book to help equip the next generation of environmental decision makers and just educated public to have a different mindset for thinking through complex environmental issues, or again, to at least acknowledge that a different mindset from their own may exist. And that, I think, is a baseline step that we need before we can start to have these change-making conversations about relationships between people and the environment and what we're going to do to resolve some of these grand challenges that we face here in the 21st century. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'd love to spend any time that we have left chatting about the book or other work or things that you want to talk about. So thanks so much.
Questions for Dr. Emanuel? Go ahead.
There's been some attempts at regulatory reform of the swine industrial complex. Has there been in the last 20 years any actual measurable progress in reduction of pollution of the streams, the rivers of North Carolina?
Not that I'm aware of. If anything, over the past 20 years, we started to see things like the presence of antimicrobially resistant bacteria in the wild. It's been detected in shallow groundwater beneath some of these facilities. So we know what the technological solutions are to the problems of livestock waste disposal. They're practiced in other parts of the world. But at scale, we haven't adopted them here in the US. There are some exemplars. There are individuals who have invested in these waste management solutions, which are quite expensive. I will acknowledge they're very expensive solutions, but people are doing it and they're showing how it can be done here in the Southeast. But by and large, since this industry rose up in the mid-1980s, the waste management practices have remained essentially unchanged.
Have any other questions? Okay, we'll start here.
Yeah, can you offer your perspective on why Robinson County has turned to the Republican Party rather than the Democratic Party, which they were supporting for a very long time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Robinson County is reflective of trends throughout the rural South. And just because there's a large Native American population there, I don't think makes it politically unique. I will say that what is underreported is that registration rates and voter turnout rates are very low among American Indians in Robeson County. In fact, the 2020 election is the last one for which I have detailed data. More than half of American Indian adults stayed home. So the plurality of votes went to no one, at least in the American Indian community. But that doesn't make for as sensational a news story as Lumbee people have flipped, or it's not as simple a story as Donald Trump expresses support for resolving Lumbee's legal issues, and so they now support him. I think it's more complicated than that, but I will say that Lumbees, despite their political diversity, do reflect trends that we see throughout the rural South.
And you know the percent of self-identified Lumbees in Robeson County of the total population?
The total population of Robeson County is approximately 40% American Indian. Of those, I would say about 90% are Lumbee. There are a number of American Indians in Robeson County who reject Lumbee political identity. And in fact, on the map that I showed from the book, I have a label for Tuscarora people. And in the 1960s, there was an irreconcilable political rift within our community, and it resulted in the formation of essentially a new polity, the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina. So there is a fraction of American Indians in Robeson County that is their tribal identity.
Okay, we'll move that one a sec. Go ahead.
You alluded to it that President Trump's pledge to recognize Columbia. I think the deadline is either upcoming or has recently passed. Have you heard anything on that?
No, the deadline was last week. So that was the deadline for the Secretary of Interior to respond to the president's memo from January. And that memo simply directed the secretary to deliver a report on what the options are for resolving this legal limbo that the tribe has been in for the past several decades. I am skeptical about this entire proposition because I think we already know what the options are to resolve the 1956 Lumbee Act. It can be amended by Congress. The tribe can petition the Bureau of Indian Affairs for administrative acknowledgement. But if they don't amend the act, they risk a lawsuit if the Bureau of Indian Affairs acts on their petition. And then the third mechanism is through the federal courts. If the tribal government has standing in a federal court case where a decision could have some implications for the tribe's status, that's the third mechanism. And we've known that those three mechanisms exist for decades. And I don't really see how a new Secretary of Interior will come up with any options that differ substantially from those three.
I remember, I believe it was in the same Science by the Slice program a number of years ago, where UNC were talking about, maybe I'm wrong, but a program to help people in counties where there's a lot of environmental justice by giving them the ability to test their own wells and come up with solutions.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you knew more about that. I just, or could share some of that, because I thought it was an amazing story, you know.
I remember that one. I
Yeah.
can't remember where it was though, which counties it was in. It could have, I thought it was in Western NC, but it might have been.
Well, they used a lot of different counties, I think,
Yeah.
in Eastern, and I do know they eventually gave out water pitchers to people. The people had lead in the water and other things. It wasn't just this. And I believe Virginia Tech was involved in some of the testing. But it seemed like, I think it's still going on, some kind of program.
The programs that I'm familiar with, there are two kinds. The first kind is affiliated with universities. So UNC, to some extent, and then out-of-state universities. I think Virginia Tech is still working in Robeson County. I think Johns Hopkins is as well. And as part of their reciprocal work with communities, they are testing or giving testing supplies to communities, but they're also providing filtration systems or things like this to try to remediate problems that are daylighted. The other initiative I'm aware of is actually being led by the industry. I don't know if there's some kind of administrative order or what, but Chemours has been conducting some testing in that area for perfluorinated compounds. I don't know what the resolution is, if there's any reciprocal measure that they're offering to people who have Gen X or PFAS or whatever in their water.
That's a new thing, the forever chemicals.
Yeah, but Robeson County is just across the river from the Chemours plant, right? So understandably, we are concerned with communities that are drawing surface water from the Cape Fear River downstream of that facility. But, we also know that those compounds were airborne, wet deposition. They've ended up in shallow groundwater, eventually in surface waters outside of the Cape Fear watershed.
Yeah, go ahead.
You might have mentioned this, but what was the audience that you wrote the book for? Like, who should read it?
Yeah, so I wrote it for three different audiences. One audience was made up of students of environmental policy and environmental science, specifically like the kinds of students that I teach at Duke and at NC State, who are going into environmental technology or environmental management careers. Over the past decade, I've interacted with so many people who have received world-class education in environmental science and management, and did not have really any knowledge whatsoever about environmental justice concepts, methodologies, very little knowledge about Indigenous peoples, how to engage meaningfully. So on one hand, I wrote the book for that audience. I wrote the book for Indigenous peoples as well. I wanted my people, Lumbee, and other Native peoples to see that they were not alone, that their stories were not isolated cases of getting dumped on with pollution, but this is systemic in nature. And even if you're not from a community in North Carolina, you read these stories and something resonates and says, hey, we have an analogous situation in our community. It helps to connect the dots to see the bigger pictures. The third audience is the interested public. We have a lot of people who have not quite enough knowledge about environmental justice and Indigenous rights to be dangerous. Maybe they've heard what happened at Standing Rock a few years ago, and they have some innate sense that something went on there that wasn't right, but they can't articulate the concepts and principles. And so the book is also for people that follow this kind of news or consider themselves to be interested in the environment, environmental issues. So those are the three audiences.
You have any other questions? All right, thank you so much.